The End. As we know it today, it's a purple, ominous realm filled with hostility and death. But it couldn't have always been like this. There must have been a time before this era of darkness. So what did the End look like back then? Before the darkness engulfed these lands? Let's find out. Billions of years ago, the universe was born. And after a few million years, it had become a boiling mess of gases and rock. Over time, those gases and rocks gathered and clumped together, and they formed stony islands. Now, some of those islands, or asteroids, if you want to call them that, were tiny, whilst others were massive. And a vast collection of these molten islands formed within a large 60 million by 60 million block area. And somehow they all gained a somewhat stable gravitational connection to one another. Their gravitational bound connection meant that they wouldn't drift away from each other, and were in a way all one world. A world that we would later come to know of as the End. But right now, the End was a boiling wasteland, filled with boiling gas and floating magma islands. It was effectively just a mess in a constant state of heat. In fact, it was so hot that those magma islands were less rock and more liquids almost. But slowly, over time, the End drifted away from that hot region of the universe, and it began to cool down. Over a few millennia, those islands of molten magma cooled into stone, and for the first time ever, it was now theoretically possible to stand on the End Islands. Now, no one would have done that, because at that time the End was a dead land of stone, with not even a single form of basic life across all the millions of islands within it. The End was at that time a land of asteroids within the universe, and it was a boring, dull, lifeless land. But very slowly, something began to happen. The sky turned blue. As the End began to drift towards a region of space that was rich in bright stars. There were likely billions of them, all brightly visible to the End, which together in their great concentrations cast a blue-like atmosphere, or sky within the realm of the End. Well, I should use the word atmosphere very lightly, given that the End didn't really have one at this point. They were more just floating rocks that were connected to one another. Also, it didn't even have a star to orbit, so all of its light were from the millions of distant systems that the End just so happened to be close enough to receive their light from, but not close enough to receive a permanent connection to. And thus it was still somewhat dark, and rather cold. However, it was still close enough to a large volume of stars that life was now theoretically possible within the End. But due to the lack of bright light and heat from a personal star, the traditional form of life that we're more familiar with wouldn't have been possible within the End. Life here was going to be exotic, as it needed to be far less reliant on sunlight, and it needed to be able to cope with colder environments if they wished to thrive. But thankfully, there was a form of life that met that criteria: the fungi. It was perfect for these conditions. It required very little light, and it could survive in rather cold temperatures. And so mycelium might have begun to gradually emerge onto the surface of the End Isles. Starting out small in a few rare pockets upon the stony lands, the mycelium might have begun to burrow into the stone, gathering the land's abundant minerals and resources, and thus that would have allowed the mycelium to thrive and expand across the islands. Given the blue hues of the skies of the End at that time, it's very possible that the mycelium that grew here would have appeared in a dark shade of blue. Now, due to the lack of competition and wide open spaces, the mycelium had the potential to spread everywhere, with almost no barriers. Resources might have been somewhat scarce within the stones, but this fungal life was going to find a way. Just as you should find a way to press that subscribe button so that you too can thrive in the End. Spores might have even been spread from island to island, thus meaning that over a relatively short few million years, most of the End could have been covered in a thin layer of fungal life of the mycelium, and soon that fungal life would have started to evolve. Initially it would have been rather slow, but over time mushrooms would have sprouted up, Now, these small initial mushrooms would have been rather inefficient with resources, thus meaning they would have been rather rare, and they likely would have only sprouted up on the larger isles, where resources, while still rather scarce, were available in enough quantities for survival. Over time, these mushrooms would have likely evolved to be more efficient with their resources, and thus that would have allowed for more mushrooms to inhabit smaller spaces, and so they would have become more common within the end, with their numbers rapidly increasing. However, with the increase in fungal lives to feed, but with no increases in the resources available, the mushrooms would have been forced to start competing for resources, and thus, an arms race might have unfolded with the mushrooms, as each mushroom would have had to evolve rapidly as they attempted to outcompete one another for the limited resources of the end. Perhaps some grew darker shades, such as pure black or dark yellow, so that they could better hide within the shadows of the end, but some might have done the opposite, as they perhaps could have started to glow, as some sort of growth strategy, or self-defense strategies. Or perhaps others grew to be large, so that they could have greater absorption power of resources, and, alternatively, some might have tried to be as small as possible, to try and use as little resources as possible. Maybe they even grew to have more powerful spores that could spread over greater distances, thus allowing for more isolated lands that have never encountered mycelium to also be infected. Maybe some even began to grow upside down. We really don't know. But overall, whatever adaptations the mushrooms endured, the end would have been a thriving metropolis of fungal life, and it would have been unlike anything that we could possibly imagine. And maybe, as a result of those successes, actual advanced animal life could have emerged onto the end. With access to food supplies in the form of those mushrooms, small basic animals would have had the resources that they would have needed to not just survive, but thrive within the End Isles. Over time, those tiny creatures would have also evolved to better suit their environment, just as the mushrooms would have done, but they would have done so in a very different way. For instance, they might have developed the power of flight, so that they could better reach all available foods that were on other islands. Or maybe they gained the power of inverted vision, that way they could better see within this dark land. Or maybe they even evolved to digest every single part of the fungi and utilize all of its resources, even the toxic parts. And that could have potentially allowed these creatures to have toxic breath. Now, there were likely very few of those creatures, as resources were quite scarce within the end, and competing for the same food supplies within the same areas would have only led to the demise of all those competing. They needed to be separate. Thus, it's very likely that each of those creatures would have had their own personal domains, an area within the end where they could harvest their own mushrooms and thrive independently. Now, they would have likely met at certain times, but it's more than likely that these creatures would have had to have been fiercely independent. Collaboration just wouldn't have been beneficial within the end. But regardless, the evolution of those creatures would have continued, likely growing bigger wings so that they could fly even further to reach even more food. And perhaps they even grew larger throats and more powerful voice boxes, so that each distant creature could better communicate with other distant creatures. And so if you haven't guessed it yet, those tiny creatures might have evolved to become the dragons. Flying dinosaurs that could have roamed the end for millions of years. And maybe it was during this time that the end crystals magically appeared, thus allowing the dragons to heal in brand new ways, making them almost immortal gods of this land. The end would have been a truly magical place to explore. However, we must not forget that the end was still just a set of gravitationally bound rocks floating through space, and as such their time in that blue region of stars, where life was actually possible, was merely temporary. It might have lasted for a few million years, or maybe even a few billion years, but it was going to come to an end eventually. And thus, via the power of the mystical dark energy forces of the universe, the end would have been pushed away from those bright blue star systems, but that would be just the beginning of the end's adventures across space. For as time flowed onwards, those dark energy forces would grow stronger and stronger and stronger, accelerating the end further and further away from the stars, and at a quicker pace too, anything that wasn't gravitationally bound to the end vanished from view. Over billions of years, those once bright blue stars that illuminated the night sky would have faded into tiny grey dots that were almost invisible from the perspective of the end. The end was getting dark. Any light that would have reached the end from those distant blue stars would have undergone a phenomenon called redshift, meaning those once bright blue stars were getting further and further away from the end at an increasing speed, and as such their light, or the dim version that was reaching the end, was being distorted to a slight red hue, and so that's why the dull light of the end is purple. Also, because the end was heading into this great void of just pure nothingness, with no stars and no source of light, the end became colder and colder, as this reduction in light meant less heat and less energy, and over time this led to the death of the larger mushrooms, as they froze to death. And then, as the effects of the cold isolation within the galaxy became more extreme, the smaller mushrooms also died out. And then as the end continued to drift into the dark abyss of pure nothingness, those effects became even more extreme. Even the thin layers of mycelium that had endured so much within the end would also die out. As their physical forms decomposed, the damage that they had done to the stones of the end were revealed. You could clearly see where the stones were cracked. This had occurred due to billions of years of burrowing by the mycelium. Also, the decomposed remains of the fungi fused into the stone, and thus it gave the stones of the end a slight yellow hue. However, despite that sounding quite odd, it added strength to the stone, and it made them stronger and more blast resistant. And that stone is the End Stone. And so that was it. The End had become a desolate set of yellow stony islands, devoid of any life, floating through the vast expanse of a dark universe. The End had become dark, purple, ominous lands that were just waiting to be explored. Despite the danger that lurks within them, they are truly interesting places to be. But wait, what happened to those dragons? Well, consider watching this video to find out.